I'm Connor Ruebusch, and if you are interested in the finer points of face punching, you've come to the right place. This is Heavy Hands. Hello, ladies, gentlemen. Welcome to Heavy Hands. I am your host, Connor Ruebusch. It's a weird, stilted intro. Joined once again by my co-host, Dr. Patrick Wyman. And today we have, UFC Fight Week is not quite upon us. It is nigh. And as a way to lead up to it, we will be having the first of 3 episodes dedicated to the 3 events taking place in 2 weekends. Next weekend, those being Thursday, July 7th, Friday, July 8th, and Saturday, July 9th. Pat, you know how wonderful I am with dates. When we were trying to set up this schedule, I could not keep the numbers straight in my head. We have a whole host of incredible fights. That's why we're planning an extra episode next week so we can try to cover all the stuff that is really worth covering. And even then, we're still having to knock a few things off the docket that we would definitely enjoy talking about on any other given week. Today, we'll be discussing the first of those events. That is UFC Fight Night. What are they calling this one?
UFC Fight Night. I don't know. It's like Rafael Dos Anjos' personality itself. I think this Fight Night is too generic to deserve a descriptor.
Yeah, it's also in Vegas, so they can't call him Vegas. It's too generic. So it's just UFC Fight Night, Dos Anjos versus Alvarez. If that name in itself isn't enough of a hint for you, we should let you know that the main event of this card is a lightweight title fight between the newly dominant Rafael Dos Anjos, who has looked like an absolute force of nature ever since the first round of his title-winning effort against Anthony Pettis last year, and Eddie Alvarez, the one of the most intrepid and exciting journeymen. And I say that with all due respect. Journeyman can sometimes seem like a slight to some people, but he is a guy who has quite literally journeyed across the globe and fought a who's who of fighters in and out of the UFC, Strikeforce, other organizations like that, Bellator, all that kind of thing.
He never fought in Strikeforce, did he?
Strikeforce vets is what I meant to say. That kind of scene. And like the non-UFC scene, now in the UFC, has already fought a host of really good guys in that arena. And he comes off of an effort against Anthony Pettis as well, which we can talk about as the show goes on. Both you and I thought Pettis should have won that fight, but we can also talk about why we can both acknowledge that Eddie Alvarez got the win and how the skills he showed in that match might come into play here. The other 3 fights we will be discussing today. Next up after that, we'll be talking about one of the first fights from UFC 200, which we will be parceling out over the next 2 episodes until we get to the official UFC 200 show, that being the return of Brock Lesnar, who is fighting Mark Hunt in the co-main event of UFC 200. Pat and I are going to do a punch-counterpunch segment for that. Pat arguing the case for Mr. Lesnar, me arguing the case for Mr. Hunt, the Super Samoan. And then after that, we're going to give a quick look at 2 other exciting fights happening on the undercard. Joe Duffy versus Mitch Clark, one of the true good guys in MMA, Mitch Clark, and I'm happy to see him making his return. And Anthony Birchak versus Delena Lopez, which should just be absolute fire.
I am very, very excited for both of those fights, and there are other fun fights on that card too.
Oh yeah,
that we won't really have time to
Pyle
talk about.
Versus Mina, McDessie versus Baghdad. There's a lot of really fun fights here.
Gilbert Burns versus Lucas Sayevsky should be a fun fight.
Russell Doan and Pedro Munoz. These cards are all Pedro Munoz is fighting. We both love Pedro Munoz. All these cards are jam-packed, so we apologize if anybody has like certain pet fights that they were really looking forward to hearing us break down. There's just so much to cover that even with an extra episode, we can't possibly get to everything that's worth talking about. But with that, why don't we go ahead? Actually, before we start, I do want to thank some of the people who supported Heavy Hands in the month of May, and I promise you, I have those people's names in a document which is now open. Those people are Axel Holt, Henry Protzman, Emil Vong, Angel Jambazov, Mark Guagenti, Matt Giordano, Ricky, Will Tiernland, Ben Cohn, Shane Walsh, Owen, Chris Rini, Carl Calmer, and Chris Duncan. All of these people, and there will be 2 more sets that we'll be reading throughout the show. supported us to the tune of $3 or more. Thank you very much, guys. We really, really appreciate it. We hope you're enjoying the show. You are the wind beneath our wings. All of you, by the way, who pledged $3 or more should have received a free code to get a free copy of our UFC 100 Classic commentary. Some people said that's not free, but because you are pledging $3 a month, but consider it like a free drink to thank you for purchasing dinner at our restaurant. That's how we look at it. We want to thank you in that way. And anybody else who hasn't checked that out, by the way, we spent 2 hours and 15 minutes talking about the 4 big fights from UFC 100. Now that 200 right around the corner, you can hit play when you see the Zuffa logo with that track. It costs just $3. We really appreciate your support. Of course, you're welcome to contribute more than that if you like. And you can basically listen to us crack jokes and analyze the technique and talk about the historical impact of the card. It was a lot of fun to record. So if you enjoy it, check it out, give it a look. Send it to your friends, all of that stuff. The more successful it is, the more likely we'll be able to do more, and the more frequently we will be able to do them. Because it was fun, but we got to be able to justify such an expenditure of time. You know how it is. Well, RDA Alvarez. That's first up on the docket, Pat. I'm going to let you lead off.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting fight, and I think despite the fact that Dos Anjos is coming in as more than a 4-1 favorite, this matchup is actually, in kind of its broad outlines, not the specific manifestations, but in the broad outlines of the matchup, I think this actually might suit Alvarez a little bit better than his last fight against Anthony Pettis did, or even his fight against Gilbert Melendez did, because I don't think that Alvarez, what we saw from Alvarez in his last 2 fights was that he had to pressure. He had to get in guys' faces and push them back towards the fence, and he had to wrestle a lot. He had to do things that he wasn't necessarily really comfortable with. That was something he struggled with when he fought Donald Cerrone in 2014. He's much more comfortable kind of sticking and moving on the outside, circling, picking and choosing his angles to get in and out of range. That will serve him much better against Rafael Dos Anjos than it would have against either of his last 2 opponents. So I think the broad outlines of the matchup are better for him, even if I think the 4-1, I think him being like a 3.5-1 underdog is still perfectly justified given the specifics of the matchup.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's a tough order for anyone to go in there and say, I'm going to get pressured by Rafael Dos Anjos. That's not an enviable situation to be in. But for a guy like Eddie Alvarez, it affords him the opportunity to just basically accept the kind of fight he likes to fight. All of his best performances throughout his career have been of that nature. His rematch with Michael Chandler, the fight with Pat Curran, the fight with Patrick Freire, all of these fights where he moves around on the outside, uses that angular footwork that makes him so difficult to find. And of course, we have to give a shout out to Mark Henry, who, if you haven't heard it, gave a spectacular interview to us not long ago. I'll look up the episode number if I can. But Eddie has been working very extensively with Mark in the lead up to this fight. I think he's working a little less with the Black Zillions team now and more with Mark, if my sources are correct, which they may not be. But there are a few trainers who can better prepare a fighter for an Eddie Alvarez kind of fight. Sticking and moving on the outside, throwing good combinations and escaping on different angles after you step in, picking your spots, fighting intelligently, and making the other guy chase you around and waste his energy. That is Mark Henry's MO. He did it brilliantly with Frankie Edgar. He's done it brilliantly with Edson Barboza. That's what he does really well. And Eddie Alvarez, that's his natural inclination. So I'm actually really hoping to see kind of a revitalized, sharpened Eddie Alvarez in this matchup since he's been working so much with Mark.
Yeah, so I think we're talking about the kind of matchup that, generally speaking, suits Alvarez's natural tendencies, combined with a coach who really excels at teaching those things. Like, if you're looking for reasons to be bullish on Eddie Alvarez going into the fight, those are the reasons. Now, the problem is, I don't think that there is a more technically sound or cleaner pressure fighter in all of MMA than Rafael Dos Anjos. In terms of somebody who combines aggressiveness with technical skill, with durability, with everything you need to be really, really good at pushing somebody towards the fence. I don't think anybody has more of those things together in one package than Dos Anjos does.
I agree with you.
Because good pressure consists not just of footwork, but of using strikes to cut off the space of the cage to limit your opponent's options for escape. So you have to be really good at taking small steps, and then you have to be able to use your strikes to cut off the space that your opponent wants to move into, to make it, to kind of herd them back and forth using those strikes until the only option they have is to go straight backwards. That's the essence of pressure, and Dos Anjos is great at that. Not only that, he takes away the other option would be, well, if you can't get away, you can plant your feet and counter the guy as he comes in. So that way you can create just enough hesitation, just enough space to be able to angle out and get back to safety. Well, Dos Anjos is perfectly happy to stay in the pocket with you and exchange. Yeah. So it takes away that option from you. Basically, he very methodically takes away every single possibility that you have for ways to get him off of you. He doesn't give you any space to breathe. And as time's gone on, he's gotten more and more comfortable at staying closer and closer to his opponent.
Yes.
So thereby giving you fewer and fewer breaks.
Yeah. We've talked about this some in the past, even in relation to RDA, but let's go into kind of the specific nitty gritty of what makes him such an effective pressure fighter. Explore some of the things you just mentioned. Footwork is obviously a big one. I think there are very few fighters who don't know how to, at the very least, sidestep, and that is probably the most important movement you need in just basic footwork terms for a pressure fighter. Being able to pivot off the back foot is really helpful as well. That's one not a lot of people talk about. In fact, if you ever look up, it's kind of crazy. If you ever look up pivots, for example, on YouTube, if you're trying to find a tutorial, or if you even ask most coaches what a pivot looks like, you'll almost only ever hear about front foot pivots. And I could go on for days about how terrible a lot of techniques for teaching front foot pivots to the right are, because that's a very difficult motion for a lot of people, and you come up with a lot of creatively awful ways of executing it. I saw somebody teaching fighters to cross their feet in order to pivot to their right, step across their right leg with their lead left leg, and then step to the side, which I hate. But still, all the instruction pretty much revolves around front foot pivots. Back foot pivots are very useful for a pressure fighter, because what happens when you pivot on your front foot is you turn your back away from the center of the cage. If your back is to the cage, my back is to the center, you're backed up against the fence, I'm in open space, and I pivot to the left on my lead foot is the center point. I revolve around it. And because it is closer to the fence than it is to the center, I then create a lane for you to find the center of the cage. I kind of negate my own pressure. If I keep my back foot planted, if I turn my back foot first and then adjust with my lead foot, my back foot is now the anchor. And since it basically occupies the center of the cage, I'm constantly in front of you and facing you, so that you have to move to the side to get around me without me hitting you. Rafael Dos Anjos does that really, really well. And aside from just technique, he's very cognizant. There are so many sequences in that Anthony Pettis fight, Pat, where Pettis would start moving, and instead of chase after him, Dos Anjos would take the opportunity to just move to the side and take a very short, direct line so that he could meet Pettis where he was headed. Pettis didn't have the tight footwork to navigate around him, maybe feint his way forward or hit him and then spin. He had to sidestep and skip along the cage. And so for Dos Anjos, that is a very welcome trade. Even if he's not hitting you constantly, it's very welcome, because if you just think of the perimeter, say we think of the centermost of the two black lines that go around the octagon, that is about 5 feet closer to the center of the octagon than the fence is. And so circumnavigating the edge of the cage around the fence, you cover, 100 feet, something like that. Circumnavigating the black line, you cover 80 feet. You move a lot less if you consistently keep yourself between your opponent and the open space at the center of the cage. And that means that they have to expend a lot more energy. So that's something Dos Anjos is very, very cognizant of, making sure you never have an easy path. And if you do make a good technical adjustment, he'll try to punish you on the way out. But typically, he is always just trying to stay in front of you. There's a tremendous amount of mental pressure, and it's like when somebody holds their jab out and you just see it. It's like Dan Henderson's right hand. It's just cocked in his shoulder like a rocket launcher. You know it's going to come at you at some moment. The physical presence of a guy like Rafael Dos Anjos right in front of you is so taxing, when you know that you basically have to go through him, because he won't stop standing in front of you. It's very frustrating and very difficult for even a guy as slick as Eddie Alvarez to deal with.
It's basically impossible to spend more than a few seconds of any fight with the current iteration of Rafael Dos Anjos without feeling his breath in your face. And
Yes.
I mean that literally. Like that he sticks to his opponents like glue.
Yeah.
And the rough equivalent of the Dan Henderson right hand in a Rafael Dos Anjos fight, just knowing that it's always cocked and ready to go, is his left kick.
Yeah.
Right? So he fires that early and often. And he's one of the few guys in MMA, I think, who kicks like a Thai.
Yeah.
And that's probably because he spent so much time training at Evolve in Singapore with a whole bunch of Thais. Like, that he doesn't give a shit whether you're going to try and check his kicks or not. He doesn't give a shit whether your elbow's there. He doesn't give a shit whether you're going to block it or not. He's just going to kick you as hard as humanly possible over and over and over again. And this makes his job of pressuring you a lot easier because he knows that just by nature, you're going to try and stay away from his left side. That means that probably, what do you think, 7 or 8 times out of 10, his opponent is going to try and move away from that left side, which means in terms of his footwork and his diagonal steps, he only needs to worry about cutting you off in one direction most of the time.
Pretty much. And of course, you touched on this as well, the trajectory of that strike. The left kick from an open stance matchup is pretty much the best possible weapon for corralling an opponent, especially when you throw it to the arms or to the body. There is no way around that strike when you're backed into the cage. You could maybe do a Robbie Lawler type thing and jump over it if you're insane, which again is very demanding. There's basically, you're going to take it on the arms, and then you might get around it, but that wears you down. You might take it to the body. You might get hit in the head. All of these hurt, and they wear you down as the fight goes on. Now, chances are when you do get hit with that kick because it's so impactful, then you're going to be either stuck in place or bumped over to the other side. You can't move through it. And because you can't step back, you can't go around it. You could check it, but again, when you check kicks, you have to plant your feet. You have to stay in place. So all of this augments Dos Anjos' pressuring. And the other thing he does so well, which is something I probably prattle on about over and over every time we talk about pressure fighters, but Rafael Dos Anjos knows how to go side to side, he knows how to move forward, and he knows how to attack while doing both. And it's the linchpin of a really effective pressure game against high-level outfighters that many pressure fighters are missing. That they can't attack on diagonals. They can't step forward offline to throw the cross as you're moving to the side. They can't step forward offline to land the kick. They can't move towards their left with a left hook and move in these diagonals, which you have to do. Because if the guy can time your linear attacks and all you do is attack in straight lines, then your side-to-side footwork as you're cutting off the cage matters a lot less. Because he knows all he has to do is get you to attack or wait for you to attack, and then he can evade or even take the shot and get around you because you've just lunged in straight. Dos Anjos does such a good job of coming in on these diagonals, so as you're trying to sidestep his strikes, you're still getting hit by them. He's moving with you even as he closes the distance. So he's just such a punishing fighter. And again, like you said, he's so close to you all the damn time now that the chances of you evading those strikes are very slim. It's just he doesn't give you a moment to breathe. Even when he's not always pressuring, Dos Anjos is always ready and close enough to respond with something very hurtful.
Yeah, it's a really, really strong combination of skills that he has in his game. And like, he puts the fence to good use in every phase. It's not just that he uses the fence well as a striker. It's that when you get yourself backed up to the fence, then suddenly Dos Anjos has a world of options available to him. So if he flurries and you cover up, well, he's just going to duck under and try and suck you away from the cage with a double leg. He's really, really good at that. Mm-hmm. If you manage to keep your stance and avoid his strikes, and you manage to avoid, you make it so that you can defend takedowns, well, then he's going to step into the clinch and hit you with a few good shots and a knee before either then stepping back out, taking nice, really small, subtle steps to adjust and flurry, or he's going to duck under for a takedown. It's a trio of options that he has available to him in that space. As long as you're backed up, and even on the ground, Dos Anjos uses the fence to his advantage. He's really, really good at pinning your hips against the fence, not giving your hips any place to go while he's on top. He did that to Donald Cerrone. He did that really, really effectively to Anthony Pettis. Like, he's just very good at that. Like, I don't think there's any fighter in MMA who uses the fence more effectively in every single phase of the fight than Dos Anjos.
Yeah, and mentally, I think what makes this fight so intriguing is the fact that these are probably two of the gamest fighters in this division, aside from probably Tony Ferguson. and maybe Khabib Nurmagomedov. There are not many other guys who are as willing to respond like for like to what their opponent tries to do to them. It has definitely gotten Eddie Alvarez into trouble in the past. He's not the most durable guy in the world, though he's very crafty and very difficult to finish, even when very badly hurt. And he's pretty hittable, or at least has been in the past, though he may have improved that somewhat in his recent fights. But still, the thing with Eddie Alvarez is that when you fight him, you know that he will stand his ground and respond. He's not fearful of any of his opponents, and Dos Anjos is the same. I remember so clearly, I have the image in my head, which is going to be very embarrassing that I said that now if I describe it incorrectly. But I remember very clearly, I think, Rafael Dos Anjos fighting Ben Henderson, and Henderson hits him with a big body shot, that big right hook to the body that Henderson likes so much, that like old school boxer leaping body shovel hook to the body. And Dos Anjos, he takes it, he doesn't like it, he comes back with the exact same shot, and then just rails Ben Henderson in the legs with a kick. And that's what he does. He did the same thing to Anthony Pettis. Every time Pettis would let go that open stance kick, Dos Anjos fired one back. Now, that competitiveness can be a problem for some fighters, but when you are putting such an immense physical and mental pressure on your opponent all the time, I think that gamesmanship really, really adds to that. When you know that even when you hit this guy, even when you score, it's worse for you because he doesn't let you get away with hitting him. And Alvarez...
You saw what that did to Anthony Pettis, right? That Pettis is a guy who depends entirely on your fear of him.
Yes.
To create space that Pettis relies on you not wanting to get hit by him. That is the basis for everything that makes Anthony Pettis' game work. If you're not afraid to get hit by Anthony Pettis, then suddenly he's not nearly as imposing a fighter.
Yeah, and Dos Anjos wasn't terribly easy to hit either. He's actually not a bad defender coming forward. He moves his head, he moves his feet well, he keeps a good guard, and he knows how to adjust his body so that he catches those punches and kicks on his arms. But the fact is that when he does get hit, he responds very well. He gets very coldly pissed off about it and makes sure that you answer for the fact that you hit him, which just adds to the whole game. I do want to raise one point before we wrap up. What do you think the chances are with Eddie Alvarez having played such a wrestling-heavy game in his past two fights of Alvarez coming in and trying to do to Dos Anjos what Khabib Nurmagomedov did?
I think it is entirely possible that he will give that a try. But I'll say this: as Alvarez is a strong wrestler, he is bull strong. When he gets onto your hips, it's really, really difficult to get him off. We saw that for Pettis. We saw that with Gilbert Melendez, who's not a bad defensive wrestler by any stretch of the imagination.
Not at all.
He really struggled to get Alvarez off of him. I think against Dos Anjos, though, it is if you can't shove him into the fence and turn. If you can't physically overpower him, that's when we've seen Dos Anjos have problems with bigger, strong, or with wrestlers. It's been really big, really strong dudes like Gleison Tibau. Gleison Tibau was able to kind of throw Dos Anjos around. Khabib was able to kind of throw Dos Anjos around. Even Jason High, who was coming down from 170, High is probably not on Khabib's level as a technical wrestler, but he was able to take down Dos Anjos. I think Dos Anjos is a better defensive wrestler now than he was then.
Yeah.
B, I just think I don't think that without good setups, it's going to be possible to win a fight against Dos Anjos like that. I think he will be able to take Dos Anjos down, but I don't think he'll be able to hold him down. Mm-hmm. And I think that he will increasingly struggle to do that as the fight goes on.
It'll be interesting though, because it has been some time since Nurmagomedov, really, since someone has chosen to grapple with Dos Anjos rather than strike with him. The prevailing logic seems to be that you can outmaneuver him, that he's still this slow-footed, hard-hitting jiu-jitsu guy, when, of course, he's much more than that now. So the last two guys to fight him, Cerrone didn't really have a chance to try his ever-improving wrestling game before he was knocked out. And Anthony Pettis, not a great wrestler. And so I am really interested to see how Dos Anjos... how his game adjusts, because when he had to deal with the takedown threat from Khabib Nurmagomedov, and obviously Khabib is a substantially better wrestler than Eddie Alvarez. Again, not a knock on Eddie, but Nurmagomedov is on a pretty different level from most fighters with the pace he can afford to push, and the way that he chains his attacks together. He's always 3 steps ahead of his opponents on the ground. But that really, really hampered Dos Anjos' ability to let his strikes go. And so I'm interested to see if Alvarez will come in and try to use the outfighters game and shoot for reactive takedowns to make Dos Anjos hesitate, and how that will affect his pressure. I think that's one of the more fascinating aspects of this fight.
I'm with that, and I think that that's probably Alvarez's best chance. The problem from my perspective with that is that I don't think that Alvarez is particularly good at hitting those reactive shots.
No, it's not been his game in the past.
Yeah, when you look at how Alvarez has gotten his takedowns in his last few fights, it has been very little setup, him kind of bullying his way forward against a smaller, not as strong opponent, and just bullying his way into the fence and then chaining shots together before he finally gets one.
And let us not forget, Dos Anjos is a hell of a lot stronger than either Anthony Pettis or Gilbert Melendez.
Yeah, Dos Anjos is a 185, 190-pound dude who cuts to 155. He is an enormous lightweight and has put on size, is stronger, and from a technical perspective is better than he used to be too. Like, I think that I'm with you in that I think that the combination of outfighting, or of outboxing and reactive shots is how he would win this fight. I just think it's going to be really difficult for him to make that happen. Still, I think he'll have some success outboxing. I think he's better equipped to stay away from the fence than just about anybody Dos Anjos has fought in the last few years.
I'm with you.
So I think he takes a round. I'm predicting a 49-46 decision for Dos Anjos.
That sounds about right to me. In fact, I think I like Dos Anjos by a late knockout. I think ground and pound TKO, 4th or 5th round sounds about right.
Really? See, I think Dos Anjos could lose this fight for himself if he burns out trying to hit takedowns on Alvarez.
I think it doesn't happen until later. I think we basically see him having hit Alvarez and beating up his legs, and then countering Alvarez when he does have to go to the wrestling and pulling him down.
That's fair. I just I think Alvarez is just a really, really, really outstanding defensive wrestler.
It's true.
Very I think assuming Dos Anjos wins this, I think it will be almost exclusively on the feet. So we differ a little bit in the kind of particulars.
He did get RNC'd almost 2 times by Michael Chandler. It has happened to Eddie Alvarez.
He did, yeah, but Michael Chandler is a much different kind of wrestler than
he also got weirdly neck cranked by who's the karate guy that he fought back in the day? Katsunori Kikuno.
Jesus, I'd completely forgotten about that.
The bizarre, reverse full Nelson. That was a very interesting position. But I agree with you. I don't think that Eddie Alvarez will be out-wrestled by Dos Anjos the way that Anthony Pettis was. Not even close. But I do struggle to see him. Normally, I think he could match a pace with a guy like Dos Anjos, but not with the pressure and not with the power of Dos Anjos. So I think it's going to become more of a one-sided fight for Dos Anjos the longer it goes on. I'm very interested to see it. Both of us picking RDA. Why don't we take a break now? When we come back, we will talk about Brock Lesnar and Mark Hunt from UFC 200. Hey everybody, thanks for listening to this week's Heavy Hands. If you like what you hear, please consider pledging to support the podcast on Patreon. Patreon is basically continuous crowdfunding. You sign up to contribute a certain amount per month to help us with production costs and the like, and in return you get rewards ranging from a mention on the Heavy Hands website to a question or topic of your choice being discussed on the show. We have a lot more in the works to reward you for your help, and we appreciate every contribution. No amount is too small. Just head over to patreon.com and find how you can help out, the only show dedicated to the finer points of face punching. Now let's get back to it. And before we move on, we also want to thank Jorge Cabrera, Tom Grant, Scott Adkin, Liam Franks, Justin Wilson, Reed M. Kellner, Teddy Bricker, Lee Bishop, Wayne Chargwaloff, Greg, Jeff Newman, Gare, and Lorenzo Wong. Thank you guys for subscribing to Heavy Hands on Patreon to the tune of $3 or more. We truly appreciate it. Now, Pat, I understand there's something you would like to say to the listeners at home before we begin this installment of Punch Counterpunch, a segment for which, by the way, we are still waiting for a sound effect. We are talentless hacks, so if anybody out there knows how to make interesting sound effects as an intro, like a 5-second sound or something, we'd love it. Punch, counterpunch, some punching noises, psh, psh, that kind of thing. I don't know. You guys are the creative types. But, Pat, why don't you say what you're going to say before we get into arguing our cases for the two fighters in this fight, Brock Lesnar and Mark Hunt?
Okay, so I want to preface my playing devil's advocate for Brock Lesnar here by noting that I'm picking Mark Hunt to win this fight. I think that after reviewing the tape, it's the dynamic of the matchup seems to point in his direction to me. But I'm going to lay out the case for Brock Lesnar here because I think it would be a mistake to overlook him. And I want to point out the things that he does well and the ways in which that could make Mark Hunt's night very, very difficult. So I'm going to advocate for Brock Lesnar here. I'm going to play a miniature version of Paul Heyman on the technical side, but with the caveat that in the fight overall, I am actually picking Mark Hunt.
And we should say the reason we're doing a punch counter punch is because your initial inclination was to pick Brock Lesnar.
Yeah, absolutely. And I still think that he could win the fight. Yeah. And I think that where the betting odds are sitting right now, Lesnar is minus 160 and Hunt is plus 140. I think that that's about right for this.
Yeah, that's not bad. That's not bad at all.
Like there has been a real tendency that I've noted among people to kind of undersell what Lesnar was able to accomplish as a champion, and I think that there are some serious misunderstandings of both Lesnar's problems as a fighter and I think that there's some misunderstandings about Lesnar's game, what made him really good, and what his issues actually were. So I'm going to advocate for him.
I think it's also worth saying before we get into this, our sound effectless segment, that when people say the kinds of things they say about Brock Lesnar, a thing I came dangerously close to saying about Luke Rockhold, that they're only good because they're big, they're only good because they're strong, whatever. Even if that doesn't give the whole picture of why these fighters with those dominant physical traits become successful, it also doesn't expunge the fact that they are successful. You know what I mean? People say John Jones is only good because he's so big. Well, you can say actually he's good because he knows how to use his size and does so very intelligently, but also you're still acknowledging, you're just undercutting the fact that you have to acknowledge that he's very successful. So to say that Brock Lesnar was only really effective because he's such a huge, powerful heavyweight, in part that's true. That was a big part of his success, but you have to also look at how successful he was at using those traits. So I'm advocating for your advocacy of Brock Lesnar, but now I don my helmet and it becomes my duty to slay him through my avatar, Mark the Super Samoan Hunt. So why don't you say first why you think, why you might have thought Brock Lesnar has the edge here?
I'll say this, because Mark Hunt, while he has become much better at defending takedowns, does not have bulletproof takedown defense.
Right.
He has never fought anybody as overpoweringly physical as Brock Lesnar, nor has he ever fought anybody except, with the possible exception of Fedor Emelianenko, and I still think that Lesnar is more terrifying on top than Fedor. He's never fought anybody who can do as much damage to you in a short period of time as Brock Lesnar can do from the top. If Lesnar can take Mark Hunt down and hit him in the face over and over again, then Mark Hunt is going to lose this fight. If Lesnar can't do that, then he's going to lose. But I think that it would be a mistake to underestimate the chances of Lesnar being able to take down, hold down, and beat up Mark Hunt. That is Lesnar's path to victory here. He's done it before to better defensive wrestlers than Mark Hunt, and he's a guy who's incredibly dangerous on top. That's why I think he could win this fight.
Yeah. Now, so to counter that, I think the first thing I have to point out is what a big if that actually is. Yes, Brock Lesnar has fought arguably better defensive wrestler than Mark Hunt, although I maintain Mark Hunt is pretty undersold in this area, has shown some pretty stellar takedown defense in the past few years, and it has really taken a special kind of wrestle boxer more than just a wrestler to get him down and hold him down. And most other guys have either struggled to get him down, or when they have, they've definitely struggled to keep him down. And even when completely dead tired against Stipe Miocic, Mark Hunt continually managed to find ways to get back to his feet and give himself those chances to gamble on big punches and look for the knockout. The fact that fight went on into the fifth round is astounding because Mark Hunt was losing it completely, but he never stopped going for those big knockout punches. So you have to give him credit for that. The dude is teak tough, probably still, despite having been knocked out now 3 times in his MMA career, one of the toughest, I guess it's 4 times in his MMA career, one of the toughest and hardest chinned heavyweights out there. So let's talk about Mark Hunt's, what's that?
Let me throw this counterpoint at you there.
Yeah.
If you can take down a fresh Cain Velasquez, you can take down Mark Hunt.
Sure.
And the fact that Lesnar wasn't able to hold down Cain Velasquez for longer than a few seconds shouldn't take away from the fact that he was able to. He is one of 2 men to take down Cain Velasquez in his MMA career.
Sure.
The other, Fabricio Verdun. So take that as you will. But
Yes.
so I want to point that out. The other difference here, you mentioned Stipe Miocic. Stipe Miocic's top game is not in the same universe as Brock Lesnar's is. And you mentioned this. You mentioned the size factor earlier. Well, it's not just that Lesnar is really, really big. And actually, it's Lesnar, despite the fact that he's a Division I national champion wrestler, Lesnar, from a technical perspective, is much better as a top player than he is as a wrestler. He's much more technically sound when he can get on top, and he does clever technical things that make use of his size. He really likes almost like a kind of a modified quarter Nelson on top that he uses to pin your head in place. Just with one hand. He's strong enough to pin you down with one hand.
He'll put his wrist behind your head and grab under the armpit of your far side arm and then hold it against your ear.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like a quarter Nelson, basically.
Yeah.
And he really likes being in half guard. And there, he can keep all his weight down on you, force you to move underneath him, which he's happy to let you do, because you're just going to exhaust yourself. There's no way you're going to get up with 285, 290 pounds of Brock Lesnar on top. He can pin your head in place and kind of pound away. He's got good technique with his ground striking. His ability to torque his body into those short punches is second to there may be a few guys who are better than him at doing that in all of MMA. So there are technical tricks that he has. That kind of quarter Nelson is also a lovely little setup for an arm triangle should he choose to go with it. So if he can get Mark Hunt down, if he can get to that position, the fight is his to lose.
Yeah, no, so we'll come back then to the if, because that's the part of this matchup that, and I think you'll agree with me, that's the biggest question in this matchup. It's definitely a striker versus grappler matchup. Brock Lesnar's top game versus Mark Hunt's kickboxing. The if there comes into the totality, the totality of Brock Lesnar's game is why that if is so profound to me, if he can get Mark Hunt to the ground. I maintain, I said this before we began, and I'll just say it again now, even though it's going to sound like a wicked slam, I think Brock Lesnar's whole MMA game is a lot more like his former teammate Chris Tuchscherer than it is like Stipe Miocic. Now, granted, Brock Lesnar, as you said, much better on the ground. But if we talk about his wrestle boxing game, his ability to set up his entries, to answer opponents' strikes on the feet, and to withstand hard shots and still return fire, he's not very much like Stipe Miocic. The thing that made Miocic such a nightmare matchup for Hunt is not that he had a great top game, is not even that he was a great wrestler, is that he could box with Hunt competitively enough that he could make his wrestling count. He could get Mark Hunt to engage in a pocket boxing battle so that he would open up his own hips. And that is not something that Brock Lesnar has really been able to do. The superior wrestlers who he has out-wrestled in the past have also been far inferior strikers. They have been people who have conceded Brock Lesnar's range. They have exchanged punches with him, and while that sometimes works out for them, like it almost did for Randy Couture, like it almost did for Shane Carwin, like it almost did very briefly, as we saw during our classic commentary for Frank Mir, who landed some good shots into close range. And that's a dangerous place to be with Brock Lesnar, because even if you hurt him, even if he has to shell up or whatever, if he gets his hands on you, you have a very different fight in your hands all of a sudden. Mark Hunt, despite his frame, is very, very adept at fighting from a range at which Brock Lesnar is not comfortable. He does not tend to sling combinations in the pocket. He has a very reduced kind of game, very minimalist, where he will throw 1, 2, maybe 3 punches at a time and use the impact of each of those to set up the next salvo. And they come with a lot of efficient but subtle footwork in between, and a lot of measuring and pawing and feinting, and a lot of making you miss and getting out of the way when you are forced to lead and try to take him down. And I think we can both agree that when Brock Lesnar has to dive after your hips because he's uncomfortable being hit on the feet, he's a lot less successful at getting you down.
Yeah, so I agree with that. The difficulty for Lesnar in this matchup isn't going to be taking Hunt down so much as it will be getting a shot at his hips in the first place.
Yes, right.
Like so Mark Hunt, despite only being generously listed at 5'10",
yeah.
is one of the best fighters at fighting long in the sport. He has an exceptional jab that he uses for a multitude of purposes. He uses it to gauge the distance, but he uses it to score, but mostly he uses it to set the distance. And the way that Hunt puts together his jab with his footwork, with his circular footwork, his ability to move to make sure that he's not standing in one place for too long, means that you're never going to get close enough to him without difficulty get that shot. That's what made Miocic. That's what made Miocic's game plan so clever in that fight, was his ability to commit to slowly but surely shrinking that distance that allowed him to get in on a single and eventually finish those singles and get Hunt down.
Yeah.
And to not be discouraged when Hunt exploded back to his feet, that took a level of stick-to-itiveness that it's hard to say that Lesnar is going to have. If Lesnar is more Ronda Rousey than he is Stipe Miocic, right?
Yes. Yes.
I think that Rousey is probably the closest analog for Lesnar as a fighter in terms of being somebody who has pretty limited skills but is exceptional at what they actually do, and whose entire game is based on confidence. See, I don't think there's no problem with Lesnar's chin. He doesn't have an issue taking a shot in a physical sense, and this is the kind of one of the misconceptions that I wanted to address that I talked about earlier. It's not that Lesnar can't take a shot. He's not like the 2010 version of Andrei Arlovski.
Shane Carwin put a pounding on him, and he did not go away. He's not chinny in the slightest.
And it's not even that Lesnar doesn't have heart. It's that I think his confidence is pretty fragile.
Sure.
And if Lesnar starts to feel like he's really, really losing the fight, if you can dent that confidence, then I don't know that there's any coming back from that for Lesnar.
If Ronda Rousey, say Holly Holm had been exhausted after her first round with Ronda Rousey and her game had fallen apart, it would have shocked nobody to see Ronda Rousey come back and win that fight. That's what happened with Brock Lesnar and Shane Carwin. Shane Carwin couldn't keep up the effectiveness that he was having in the first round, and that allowed Brock enough breathing room to get back to where he is strong. He could rebuild his confidence in the absence of Carwin's offense. Had Carwin been able to just keep plugging away, say like the way Stipe Miocic did to Mark Hunt, then I think Lesnar, or the way Cain Velasquez did to him, that he would have broken in the first round as he did against Velasquez. I think that's the final point I'll make. There are a lot of things we could say about and maybe it'll go further, but there are a lot of things we could say about Mark Hunt's counterpunching, his ability to evade punches and stay out of range for the takedowns and to force Mark Hunt into a fight that doesn't favor his skill set. But the really big difference is in fighter mentality. And what's the name of Mark Hunt's book? Is it Born to Fight?
Yeah, something like that.
It's absolutely an apt phrase for him because, like I said, Brock Lesnar would not have taken 5 rounds of punishment from Stipe Miocic. Not that he's not tough, not that he's not durable, but Brock Lesnar would not have seen a path to come back after the first 2 rounds of that. And Mark Hunt kept seeing windows that he could come back and win.
Like, I don't think I think that you can trace the crumbling of Lesnar's career not so much to what Velasquez did to him on the feet in that fight as to Lesnar not being able to hold Velasquez down when he got him down.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think it's shooting takedowns and not getting them that bothers Lesnar so much as it is not being able to hold you down once he gets you down.
Sure.
Like, I think that's the issue with confidence.
Sure, and like he did to Carwin, like he did to Mir in their second fight, like he did to Couture and to Heath Herring. When Lesnar can get a dominant position, he is a force of nature. He is inarguably one of the scariest men to have on top of you, even when he's throwing with utterly awful technique his strikes, the awkward short elbows that he finished Randy Couture with. It doesn't matter. He's on top of you. His positioning is rock solid. He's huge and strong, and he will just keep hammering away until the ref is forced to stop it. But we've seen from Mark Hunt many, many times. I think that Brock Lesnar, I think that Mark Hunt has a far better chance of surviving Brock Lesnar's world than Brock Lesnar does of surviving his.
No question about that.
Right. Mark Hunt has taken some serious beatings from top position from guys like Stipe Miocic. Again, not Brock Lesnar's top game, but still. Stipe Miocic, the mount attack of Stefan Struve, he has been beaten up from top position before to the point where the fight has been just about stopped. Even when Fabricio Verdum knocked him out, as the ref stepped in, Mark Hunt reared back and flung a hammer fist at Verdum as he stood up from on top of him. The guy, he doesn't have any quit in him. He really, really doesn't. And I think that is a huge difference here. And not to call Brock Lesnar out or say that he doesn't have heart, but that Brock Lesnar's his confidence, his mentality is very different from that of Mark Hunt. That Mark Hunt's mental acuity and his belief in the fact that there is always a way, his belief in the puncher's chance is what gives him a shot, even when fights aren't going his way, in a way that Brock Lesnar does not have that chance.
Yeah, I'm with that. Like, and this at the end of the day is why I picked Hunt in this matchup.
Yeah.
Like, there's no disputing that. Though with all of that said, like, Hunt is now 42 years old. He's been knocked out a whole bunch in recent years. If Lesnar reared back and hit him right on the chin with a bucket-sized fist, like, it wouldn't surprise you.
Oh no,
if Lesnar knocked him out. Like,
Lesnar hits real hard. Lesnar hits real hard.
Yeah, Lesnar has a puncher's chance on the feet, even if he is a god awful striker by any standard. Any standard Lesnar.
Yeah, he has some tactical idea of what to do. He's pretty coachable. When his corner gives him instructions, like in the Randy Couture fight, he follows them to a T. He just he's stiff. He's a guy who doesn't grow up striking, and it's not natural to him in the way that it is to Mark Hunt. And Mark Hunt has picked up the other side of the MMA game that he was missing, I think, to a much better degree than Brock Lesnar has.
Well, Mark Hunt is a professional mixed martial artist.
But even as a professional
Brock Lesnar is not, I don't think.
Yeah, but even as a professional fighter, Brock never developed the level of comfort striking that Mark Hunt did wrestling.
Lesnar was a professional fighter for
I was going to say that.
Years.
I was going to say that. Mark spent a good fair few years not having picked up that side of the game. So who knows? But Mark Hunt being 42 and active, I have a lot more faith in that than I do in Brock Lesnar being inactive, 38, and still suffering, I imagine, from the effects of diverticulitis, which I think really hampered the end of his career.
Yeah, so, I mean, we're on the same page about the outline of this matchup. Hunt's uppercuts alone and his ability to hit those on guys who are trying to change levels and get him down is a problem. Lesnar is not a natural waist bender when it comes to shooting takedowns in the first place. Like, he tends to, like, he does not get all of his explosiveness behind his takedowns the way that he should. He bends straight over at the waist a lot of the time, and that's going to make it even more difficult than usual to get his hips below Hunt's, and Hunt has a low center of gravity to start with. Like, all of these are reasons why Lesnar can't win the fight. All I'm saying is that if Lesnar can get Hunt down early and he can hold him down for more than 30 seconds or a minute, then Hunt is going to be in real trouble. And it would be a mistake to underrate the chances of that happening in a matchup between a 38-year-old guy who's fresh and a 42-year-old guy who's been fighting really regularly and has taken a ton of punishment in the last few years.
Yeah, even more than most heavyweight fights, this one feels very chancy. It feels like Lesnar has a bit of a puncher's chance, and I guess we could call it a wrestler's chance, that when he does get Mark Hunt down, he's going to have a better chance of most than of holding him there. And for Mark Hunt, he has the puncher's chance really, really complemented by his level of skill. So it's like both guys could have everything go catastrophically wrong for them in a single instant, where it's just irreversible, whether one of them is unconscious on the canvas or close to being unconscious with the other guy beating them up from top position. So it's a really good fight. I think it's a tough matchup for Brock, but I get why they made it. They needed someone who had some name value. They could have put him in there with a guy like Stefan Struve if they just wanted to give Brock Lesnar a win. But they wanted to give him a guy who, Mark Hunt is the guy with the most name value, who is yet the best matchup for Brock Lesnar, I think. Better than guys like Josh Barnett, better than guys like, they could have given him Frank Mir. I actually think I would have liked that better, but you know how it is. He's a guy who can be worked on the ground, who will also be in there and give Brock a very tough fight. So I like Mark Hunt. I like the Super Samoan. You do too, but I think you made a pretty good case for Brock. I would not be surprised to see the Beast get the win here. Why don't we wrap it up at that? That ends this edition of Punch Counter Punch. And when we come back, we have two other fights to talk about, and those were Joe Duffy versus Mitch Clark and Anthony Birchak versus Delano Lopez after this. Financial support is fantastic, but there are other, even easier ways to support Heavy Hands. Perhaps the best is by spreading the word. We know our fan base. You're all cool, popular people with serious social media presences. You're tastemakers and trendsetters. Okay, there are one or two of you that don't fit that description. You know who you are, but no matter what, you can always help us out by telling folks about the show. You can also give us a positive rating and review on iTunes and Stitcher, things like that. We rely on word of mouth and positive feedback to grow and improve, so thank you very much for your time and your help. Now, back to the show. And our final crop of generous patrons who more than deserve our thanks, Christopher Carlson, Thomas Lindstad, Alan Galder, Thaddeus Pryor, Joe Byrne, Keith Farrell, Eric Stinton, Abdul Jalal Choudhury, James Muley, Sayat Tiger Muay Thai, Everett Case, OGM, and Bill DeRoche. Thank you very much, all of you, for pledging $3 or more to Heavy Hands in the month of May. We really appreciate your support, and we hope that you are feeling that your money was well spent and enjoying all of the stuff we've been doing on the show lately. So, which one do we want to talk about first, Pat?
Let's talk about Joe Duffy versus Mitch Clark.
Tough fight for the man Mitch Clark. It's and I say this as a big fan of Mitch Clark's. If you've ever talked to him on social media, he's a super nice guy. When we were talking about the Reebok deal going through and how he thought it was screwing fighters, I won't say anything, but he was grateful that people were supporting the fighters and looking out for their interests, and he made sure that people knew that. He's a good guy, very nice. I will say an interesting wrinkle here is that he has, I think maybe temporarily, moved to Jackson Winklejohn for this camp. So he's no longer at the MMA lab with John Crouch, at least for the time being. That's a theme, by the way, for this entire episode, is good coaches against good coaches. We had RDA and Eddie Alvarez with Mark Henry and Rafael Cordero, and now we get Greg Jackson and ostensibly Brandon Gibson versus
Faraz
Zahabi, of course. So we get another really interesting matchup between two of the smartest camps in MMA. But as I said, it does feel like a pretty tough comeback fight for Mitch. He's been away for a while. He did say to me earlier on Twitter he's made a lot of changes and improvements in his layoff. He's taken full advantage of the time away. I hope to see that that's true, but it does feel like Joe Duffy is kind of a supercharged Mitch Clark. He kind of is good in all the areas that Mitch Clark is good in, a little bit more so. He's maybe not quite the scrambler that Mitch Clark is.
I don't know. I kind of disagree with that.
Yeah, it's. I'm trying to find a window here for Mitch. He's maybe a little more content to play bottom than Mitch Clark was in his last fight, is what I'm trying to say. Although I don't think he didn't have much of a...
You're talking about a guy in Mitch Clark who was perfectly happy to spend the entire fight against Ally Quinta on the bottom.
Yeah, but his fight with Michael Chiesa was not nearly that way. And of course, not many other people can say they spent 2 rounds, and of course it's not a good look to be in that position for 2 rounds. But not many people, including Benny Dariush, can say they spent that much time with Michael Chiesa on their back and still managed to come back to, in my opinion, pretty clearly win the final frame of what was, up to that point, a 2-10-8 round fight.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point.
And he was scrambling very well when he was being taken down. He just got locked down by, again, the RNC King, one of the best back position fighters in MMA. I think he clearly worked on that. And that's a thing that John Crouch does well with his fighters. MMA lab fighters across the board tend to be... He's kind of the low-key Rafael Cordero, isn't he? He kind of takes these guys from jiu-jitsu backgrounds, guys who train jiu-jitsu with Ben Henderson, and then turns them into capable strikers with good scrambling and clinch games. He's done that with...
They're all rock-solid wrestlers.
Yeah.
And they're all dangerous in transition. Guys like John Moraga, too.
Yeah, John Moraga. There's another guy, too, that I'm thinking of who's kind of an unheralded guy. He came in on short notice, I think, and fought Mark Bocek. I'm trying to remember his name.
Roman Salazar?
Not Roman Salazar. I know this is great radio here while I look up a Sherdog profile. It was Mike De La Torre.
Oh, yeah.
Another lab guy.
Most famous for getting submitted by the roided-up version of Brian Ortega, if memory serves.
Yep. Submitted by Brian Ortega, knocked out in 16 seconds by Maximo Blanco, but never stopped fighting. Had a really exciting fight with Yui Chul Nam. But another guy, just an example of... Again, this is a guy where if you look at John Crouch's fighters, you've said this before, you try to look at kind of the journeyman from a guy's gym to see what he instills in his fighters, not just his star players. And I think John Crouch instills very good fundamentals and very good tactical thinking in his fighters. Now we have that being complemented by a move to Jackson Winklejohn. I'm interested to see what changes those might make, though. If what Brandon Gibson did with Donald Cerrone in his fight against Patrick Cote is any indication, we could actually see some marked improvements in the technical striking of Mitch Clark now that he's been away for, I think, a year and a half. But
he's been away for, I think, 15 months.
Yeah, so close to a year.
He last fought in April of 2015.
Yeah, so, but again, it's Joe Duffy, and we have spoken very highly about Joe Duffy in the past. I will let you lead off talking about why Joe Duffy is such a tough matchup for Mitch.
Yeah, the real issue here is just physicality. Like, that Michael Chiesa had a marked speed advantage over Mitch Clark, and Joe Duffy is way, way, way faster than Michael Chiesa is. Especially not just quickness of feet, like raw athletic horsepower,
Yeah.
but also especially hand speed. Like by any standard, Duffy has absolutely blazing fast hands. Duffy's hands were markedly faster than Dustin Poirier's, and Poirier's got pretty quick hands himself. When they fought, like Poirier won that fight, but he did not win it because he had faster hands or because he was a better pocket boxer than Joe Duffy.
He won it in the clinch and on the ground.
Yeah, exactly. And so one of the things that was kind of puzzling about that fight was how subpar Duffy's defensive wrestling looked.
Yeah, like really subpar.
It was really kind of puzzling.
It reminded me of nothing so much as Stephen Thompson versus Matt Brown. Like, whoa, this guy is getting taken down way more easily than he should.
Yeah, and that's like that shouldn't be a knock on Dustin Poirier, who is a really experienced, skilled guy who trains with a lot of really, really good wrestlers, from Jason Hyatt to Gleison Tebow to Mike Thomas Brown to God knows how many other, or Mirsad Bektic.
But Duffy was like giving up both legs, both hips, like nobody's business. He was getting taken down. He was giving up the takedowns, especially
against the cage. It was like he was really unfamiliar, especially with cage wrestling.
Yeah.
And so I would imagine going into this fight, that's the kind of fight that Mitch Clark will want. He will want a grinding fight up against the cage in the clinch, which happen to be Mitch Clark's strengths. Those are the things that Clark is actually best at doing in the broad context of his skills. I would say is really getting in the clinch, being strong. He was competitive in the clinch with a really, really good clinch fighter in Chiesa for long stretches of that fight.
He kept getting taken down, and I think that was why that fight ended up being so hard for him. But it also speaks to his coachability and his mental toughness, that he was able to change things up when his usual strength did not work out for him at all.
Yeah, and so like if he can get this into the clinch repeatedly against Duffy, if he can hold him against the cage and work takedowns against the cage, then this is an easily winnable fight for him. The problem is he is just so overmatched on the feet, and if they do get into scrambles on the mat, which should be the strongest part of Clark's game, even there, Duffy is a really, really excellent scrambler himself. Unless he can pin Duffy against the cage and make those scrambles happen against the cage, I think he's in trouble.
Yeah, and this is as yet unsubstantiated, but I have to imagine that Joe Duffy has put in some substantial work on his wrestling and incorporating that into his boxing game. It will be a shock to see that fight, the Duffy fight, having played out the way it did, and for Joe Duffy to come back and show the same level of takedown defense.
Yeah, like how often do you see one of Zahabi's guys get beaten the same way twice in a row?
Right, exactly. The adjustments made in training, I expect will really come to bear in this fight. We have it's tough, man. The hand speed, the power, the defensive craft. Joe Duffy is one of the few guys in MMA who really boxes. Like the kind of stuff that Nate Diaz used to outsmart Conor McGregor. That's the kind of stuff Joe Duffy does really well, more smoothly than Nate Diaz does. Incorporating head movement, pulls, slips, and then moving into you when you follow up and chase him after he creates range, pivoting after moving his head, and slinging counter punches in there as well. It's very, very difficult to get a consistent read on where Duffy's head is going to be while worrying about him hitting you back. And Mitch had a lot of problems with the admittedly awkward striking of Michael Chiesa, but even without Chiesa's awkwardness, you have to imagine Joe Duffy is going to take advantage of the openings Chiesa found on the feet a lot more liberally than Chiesa was able to.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the things that stands out the most about Duffy's game is the footwork and the pivots to me. It's that he does a lot of really subtle thing with his feet that are just not common in MMA at all. Mm-hmm. Like Rogan talked a lot in that fight with Dustin Poirier about Duffy's hands, and he does the fact that he constantly throws it up jabs, that he keeps his lead hand really low is an unusual thing. But I think it's far more unusual that he pivots so consistently.
Yeah. Sure, there are plenty of guys who fight with their hands low, even if a lot of them don't warrant it as well as Joe Duffy does. But, I agree with you. His footwork, his subtlety with the way he moves his feet, small steps, actual pivots, not something we see defensively from a lot of fighters, even now in MMA. In the end, this matchup, not in the specific technical aspects, but in kind of the physical matchup, reminds me of another TriStar versus MMA Lab fight. And again, I know Mitch Clark is now Jackson Winklejohn, but the other fight it reminds me of is Olivier Aubin-Mercier versus David Michaud, where you have a guy in David Michaud who was very game, very coachable, and that's Mitch Clark, but just could not compete with the physicality of his opponent. And in this, it'll be the physicality on the feet, I think, rather than on the ground.
Irony of ironies, I believe Michaud was trained by John Crouch for that fight.
Oh yeah, that's exactly what I mean. It was a John Crouch versus TriStar fight.
Oh yeah. Oh, did you say that? I'm sorry,
Yeah.
I zoned out for a second.
Yeah, that's why it seems particularly prescient, because it was another matchup of the same guys. John Crouch does a really great job with fighters like that, guys who don't have a ton of athletic gifts. He turns out really crafty, stout wrestlers with good combination punching who listen to him in the corner and make adjustments well. He does that brilliantly, but there's still really no making up for the kind of natural ability that Joe Duffy has, to say nothing of the fact that he is a substantially sharper boxer and probably close to equal to Mitch Clark on the ground, if not equal or superior. Although I have to say, before we wrap this one up, Mitch Clark's, and this is something, by the way, that also is worth mentioning, the quality of these cards is spoken to by the fact that this is a really fun episode to research. Getting to watch the fights. I got to watch Dos Anjos versus Pettis. I got to watch Chiesa versus Clark. I got to watch Brock Lesnar versus Shane Carwin and Alistair Overeem. I got to watch Mark Hunt fights. So it's been really fun to watch. But the subtlety with which Mitch Clark set up that Anaconda choke, the Darce choke, was it?
I think it was a Bravo, wasn't it?
Yeah, okay. Bravo Darce, right? Those are the same thing, I believe. Which he set up on Ally Quinta, was beautiful. I don't think I've seen anyone do such a slick job of seeming to give up the guard pass, giving up north-south, and using the position to create a choke and then advanced position to finish it. And by the way, his squeeze has to be something special because Ally Quinta was out in about a second and a half. So Chiesa or Clark can do that kind of thing. But with Joe Duffy, who does not have a reputation for being easily outgrappled, and I imagine will be better at defending the takedowns, and is substantially better than the guys that Clark has beaten before as a striker. I just think it's a tough matchup for Mitch.
Yeah, I'm with that. It would be nice if it would be nice to see Clark get a more winnable matchup here, and I hope that he doesn't get cut if he loses, because he's a really good guy. He's a tough fighter. He's fun.
He's always entertaining, man. Yeah, I will be ashamed to see him go, because he's a guy who could happily fill out the undercard of any fight night and put on a guaranteed fun fight for free TV.
Yeah. So we got one more fight that we're going to talk about, right?
Yes, we have Anthony Birchak versus Delano Lopez, which, as I said at the top of the show, should be a barn burner. Two guys who are definitely willing to throw a lot of punches at their opponent's face and body and kicks and all kinds of stuff. I thought, I rewatched Delano Lopez's UFC debut, his Ultimate Fighter final with Reginaldo Vieira. I do not think he lost that fight.
No, that was closer to being. I thought that fight was closer to being 30-27 Lopez than it was 29-28 Vieira.
I thought so too. I thought there was a clear case for him winning every round. I don't remember anyone really being up in arms, probably because it's two fighters people don't generally care about, but I thought he won that fight. And so, in my mind, Delano Lopez comes into this one being 1-0 in the UFC, having put on a game, if not necessarily inspiring technical performance against Reginaldo Vieira. How do you think he matches up with the specific game of Anthony Birchak?
Well, I think it's a recipe for a fun fight, because Lopez is basically a pure counterpuncher.
Yep.
Like, he's one of the few guys, I think, who really falls into that category. He does not like to lead. And Birchak is so aggressive that he is going to give him opportunities.
Yeah.
Like, Birchak is going to come at him. He's going to throw a lot of strikes, and that means a lot of opportunities for Lopez to drop counters in there. I favored Birchak in this fight because he's so much bigger and so much more physical. Like, Lopez for a long time was a flyweight, and like a good-sized flyweight, but not, and I mean probably too big to make that weight consistently. But he was a flyweight, and Birchak is an enormous bantamweight.
Yeah,
like one of the bigger bantamweights out there,
and a physical one too, one who uses his size and power and strength.
Yeah, he's also just an athletic specimen.
Yeah,
like Birchak is so fast and hits so hard, like. I think he's going to eat a lot of leather on his way in, but I think if he can get into the clinch and avoid Lopez's guillotine and transitions, it should be his fight to lose. But God, I think he's going to get hit a lot doing it.
Yeah, I think so too. Fortunately for him, getting hit by Delano Lopez should be a much more forgiving proposition than getting hit by Thomas Almeida. it's a lot easier to take the wild left hand of Delano Lopez than it is anything that Tomas Almeida throws at you. And even then, I think Birchak has always responded well to firefights. And I think the biggest thing, the physicality is the biggest thing. The power of Birchak, the fact that he's a good wrestler with some nice setups, really good wrestling from the body lock and from the clinch, with his trips and his lifts and weird dragging sort of mat return type takedowns. But the second biggest thing, I suppose, here is the creativity of Birchak. His striking is very, very difficult for a guy like Lopez, who really just waits to counter you coming in, to predict. Lopez had a field day with Reginaldo Vieira because he didn't know how to mix up his entries. He barely knew how to feint. He didn't really know how to be unpredictable with his striking patterns. It was pretty much the same 2 or 3 setups over and over and over. And Birchak is a guy who throws a lot of kicks, weird punches off of the same side that he's just thrown a kick or a knee, doubling up on lever punches, changing stances as he comes forward. He's very unpredictable. Yes, he is still hittable coming in, but the fact that he doesn't mind being hit coming in, it kind of is to his advantage in a fight against a guy in Lopez who just can't match him for punching power. It would be a big shock to see Lopez even hurt Birchak, to say nothing of knocking him out.
Yeah, absolutely. Like it's that dynamic that makes this such an interesting fight, because like whenever you get something between somebody who a matchup between somebody who wants you to come in and somebody who is happy to come in, like that's just a recipe for fireworks. It's the reason why we decided to talk about this fight in the first place.
It's going to be great.
Yeah, it's like if you don't know who Delano Lopez is, like you should familiarize yourself, because this is going to be great. If you don't know who Birchak is, or you look at the fact that he's 1-2 in the UFC and you're like, I mean, don't underestimate Birchak. Like he does weird shit in his fights, but so does Lopez, and that too is another thing that makes this really fun. Is they're both going to do weird shit, and it's going to be violent. Yeah,
and not to oversell it before it happens, but it's a very similar dynamic to what we just saw between Shawn O'Connell and Steve Bosse.
Yes, exactly.
Guy who hangs back and slings leather at your head versus guy who recklessly comes forward throwing everything, including the kitchen sink, at you. So it's going to be entertaining. I also like Anthony Birchak. I think Lopez, while he should be undefeated in the UFC right now, his record should be 19-1 rather than 18-2. I do think this is a pretty tough matchup against a physical specimen with strong wrestling and a lot of power in his very unpredictable striking. So I like Anthony Birchak, and that pretty much sums up our episode today. Came in just under an hour and 5 minutes. Pretty good for us. We have a lot more fights to talk about, guys. Just to refresh your memories, our next 2 cards that we will be discussing. First episode of next week will come out on Tuesday, July 5th. And on that episode, we will be talking about Joanna Jędrzejczyk versus Claudia Gadelha 2, a fight I am very excited about. We'll be talking about the Korean Superboy Do-Ha Choi, who's fighting Thiago Tavares. We will be talking about... what else was there? Is it just the one other? Jose Aldo versus Frankie Edgar 2. I think that might be it.
I'm pretty sure we had Will Brooks versus Ross Pearson.
Oh my God,
right?
Will Brooks making his UFC debut, of course. Ross Pearson, Will Brooks, a fantastic lightweight fight. So again, that's Joanna Jędrzejczyk versus Claudia Gadelha 2 for the women's strawweight title. Ross Pearson versus Will Brooks in the former Bellator champion's UFC debut. And then, oh my God, Do-Ha Choi, Korean Superboy versus Thiago Tavares, and Jose Aldo versus Frankie Edgar 2 for the somewhat laughably interim UFC featherweight title. And then our next episode of next week will come out on the usually scheduled Wednesday. That's one day before Dos Anjos versus Alvarez. And on that card, we will cover everything else really worth talking about from UFC 200, which includes Daniel Cormier versus John Jones 2, Miesha Tate versus Amanda Nunes, Johnny Hendricks versus Kelvin Gastelum, and TJ Dillashaw versus Rafael Dos Anjos. I'm looking forward to all of it. I hope, having heard that lineup, all of you guys are too. Pat, aside from the episodes, what do you have coming out this week? So I know you've got a busy schedule ahead of you.
I actually do not have very much coming out this week proper. I have my Washington Post piece coming out Thursday, in which I'll be talking about the pressure game of Rafael Dos Anjos. And then I will probably have one other thing. I'm supposed to interview Daniel Cormier tomorrow. to talk about UFC 200 and John Jones and all that good stuff.
Awesome.
But they have been incredibly flaky. So if that doesn't happen, I don't want to promise too much.
Don't get into MMA journalism, people listening. Fighters very difficult to talk to.
We've literally been trying to set this up. I shit you not, for 3 weeks, and so I'm gonna try to get that out there too. But then the big thing is all of next week. Like I'll have my preview, a combined preview for the Ultimate Fighter finale and the Fight Night coming out, I want to say Saturday. Then next Monday, I'll have, before our next episode comes out, I'll have my my complete breakdown of Eddie Alvarez versus Rafael Dos Anjos. And then I think I'll have a grand total of 5 or 6 articles coming out after that over the course of next week.
You are a wild man, sir. My schedule's not quite as crazy as yours, but I do have a lot of things I'm excited about coming out soon. In addition to this week's Heavy Hands episode, probably about the same day this comes out, which is Wednesday, June 29th. I've gotten all my dates correct so far in this episode, Pat. You should be very proud of me.
I am so proud. I'm beaming over here.
Same day as this, I hope. I'm going to have a sort of a technical review of Keith Thurman versus Shawn Porter, which was an absolutely bonkers welterweight fight between two of the best welterweight boxers in the world. I'm going to take somewhat of a unique angle on that. Both guys were being talked about as the potential heir apparent to Floyd Mayweather now that he is retired, the former welterweight king. So I'm going to kind of talk about why the fight was so exciting in a not necessarily positive way. What both guys did to fail to keep their opponents from continually changing the momentum of the fight. Two guys who don't really match up to that Mayweather comparison, despite being great fighters. And then coming up after that, I've got a video coming out on Brock Lesnar's return to the UFC and what makes him such a magnetic figure. I've got a video coming out on John Jones and Daniel Cormier, previewing the interesting dynamics between those two top fighters. And then in terms of articles, over the course of the next 2 weeks, gaps in the armor piece for John Jones, gaps in the armor piece for Daniel Cormier, going to be game planning for both of those guys. And then if I have time, Jose Aldo versus Frankie Edgar, and that may come out this week. And I don't know how Pat is going to maintain his schedule because I'm barely going to keep up with mine. It's a lot more lenient than his. But it should all be fun to talk about. I love these UFC Fight Week things. I love just getting to have a whole weekend to watch all of these amazing elite fighters square off against one another, and talking about it with you guys has been a pleasure. Again, if you didn't hear it already, go head over to heavyhandspodcast.bandcamp.com and check out our UFC 100 classic commentary. There's also a UFC 91 classic commentary, another Brock Lesnar card I did with Mookie Alexander of the Three Amigos podcast a while back. Both of those are available. The way Bandcamp works, you can listen for free, but we appreciate if you want the copies and the high quality downloads that you pay the $3 and $2 price tags respectively. Help support us and take that stuff on the road with you. Thanks once again for listening, everybody. If you came here today for the finer points of face punching, you came to the right place. This has been Heavy Hands.